holy medium of blood healing. The church had yet to see proper furnishing. It was largely a rectangular hall with pillars standing in support of the roof. It bore surprisingly little faithly iconography, being only a shell of a church. Lawrence had envisioned frames to be put up between the outer walls and the pillars to create smaller areas for laboratories. The back would be left as a sort of dormitory for those residing within the church. A makeshift altar had been constructed there as well for their chalice expeditions, utilizing the only remaining symbols left in the structure. A statue of the Maiden Saint's revelation that they had modified to perform the chalice rites at, with 2 other herald statues flanking the former one, being used for the same purpose. But as of yet, there were only piles of unpacked and unassembled miscellaneous, and the only furniture having been assembled was a long table with chairs surrounding it, which all had now gathered around. So, he stood behind the chair at the end of the table, hands on his back. Not everyone present was seated, as the number of chairs did not sustain them all. Now we can begin. It is of course a big downgrade from Bergenworth, but we will make it better in time. They had just enough equipment to resume the frowned Department of the Blood, but had little resources for anything else, a topic he feared was bothering some. We'll begin right away, where we left off. He was cheery, but had not his demeanor influenced upon the others. One of the scholars timidly raised her hand. Where did we leave off? Right, of course. Pardon me. We are, after all, responsible for organizing this endeavor now, aren't we? He grew silent and thought about what had been achieved. A lump in his stomach and an escape of air made him briefly fear if anything truly had the potential Willem so adamantly protested. It was an irrational sense, but one he, despite his awareness, had problem shaking. There were the... as you know, there was the alien aspect about it. Another of the gatherers raised his voice. Are there research records? There were, of course, but turning around to the different luggage piles, he could not find or trace a memory of ever packing such records. But the thought that he would have forgotten such a vitality seemed more unlikely than finding them among the mess. Yes, they are here somewhere. With eyes darting around at the crowd, they landed onto Maria, sitting slumped in her seat, head lowered towards the table surface. Well, Maria did encounter some particularly interesting properties. She lazily turned her head his way, looking as if a complete stranger had called her name. Here, it would be best in her own words, He motioned towards her. Several sliding of chairs echoed in the empty space as they gave her the attention previously held by him. Her disinterested figure made itself straight in the seat, shooting an evil eye at Lawrence. She cleared her throat in an uncharacteristic cough.
You mean the special sedatives?
Her words crawled themselves out of her mouth. He nodded rapidly.
Yes. It was the extension of the...
Her face cringed when her poor ability to relay the information became known to her, snapping with her fingers to Lawrence in search for the words.
The restoration. Right. The restorative qualities. We did produce a much more potent sedative without the risk of nausea and such. Turned out rather gross, though, as it was mostly a concoction of blood. What of the regeneration? What?
She turned mostly to Carol, who had made the inquirement.
Oh, you mentioned that it had restorative properties? Not exactly. Or well, I'm not so sure.
Right! Lawrence suddenly recalled. We tested it on rats at first. Maria nodded.
I did make some more experiments, wanting to test the extent of this process. I mixed other components with the blood, but I think it did not work as well as it should have. I just blended them together right there on the plate. What was it you found?
He noticed how Carol had sounded particularly intrigued when posing her question, which in turn seemed to liven up Maria further as a product, and a delighted smile escaped him.
The old blood did retain its behavior and almost devour the structure of the other compounds. But I gathered that when it lost its pure form, it began to die. What was most interesting was when I mixed with just a bit of normal blood, our blood. They worked as if in a symbiosis. I half expected the old blood to dominate the properties, but it simply blended together. But I could not see the entire process. As the amount was small, it began to dry.
Did the old blood dry on its own? The person next to Maria asked.
I have yet conducted a test where it did dry. The process is much slower, at least. It was only in contact with others that its own properties seemed to fade a bit. Later I ran another test that I never managed to conclude before.
The words were cut off, and her face became blank. She slowly turned her head down, and considerably lower and timidly continued.
I only noticed the same as Lawrence did.
With her head sunk low, he was immediately bothered by her strong emotional reaction. As light-heartedly as he could, despite his sympathy, he put more force in his words. Seems we need to rapidly unpack. We do indeed have several questions to answer. Carol's broad smile shined through behind the cards held up in front of her. Her imminent victory was too sweet not to have it manifested. The grin grew as she could see Luna's distress at her own imminent loss.
No. Seriously?
She desperately whispered.
This can't be. Again? Lawrence, are you seeing this?
He leaned over and examined the excruciating apparent victory. I don't know what to tell you. You lost.
You should have saved some cards. I always tell you.
Carol tried to comfort, but her smile gave the effort a poor effect.
I know that.
Luna snapped.
But I hate losing in the first round.
She threw her cards in submission and humiliation.
I can't take this. Garman!
Her beckoning voice echoed in the high ceiling. Someone, somewhere, dropped what sounded as a pile of books at the breaking of the calm atmosphere. Calm down, Luna. I'm sure he can hear you, along with every labyrinth guardian. Lawrence snarkily remarked, seeing how German was not even above ground at the moment.
He better. I have had enough of playing games in waiting.
Carol gathered up the hand of cards from her defeated opponent.
Seems time slows when you're losing. A game, Lawrence?
She waved the cards at him. Luna had already swiftly flown up and walked out into the middle walkway amidst the panels, forming makeshift walls. Lawrence calmly took her place.
You don't believe they are having trouble?
He began shuffling the deck. Gods, no. You know them, flying around the place. The Guardians can't even see past their trail of smoke. Worry about yourself instead. His evil grin was partially masked by the hand of cards he held up in front of his face. Footsteps sounded out in the church in the middle of her first turn. Knowingly their eyes met over their wall of cards, and with an increasing murmur, became sure that the labyrinth prospectors had finally returned. They nearly tossed their cards, filled by anticipation, and left for the altar. Smoke had begun billowing out on the floor and continued on through the middle walkway. The panels walled off the interior into smaller sections, making one able to see straight down to the end of the grand hall, to where the prospectors emerged, one by one from the smoking chalice. Other scholars emerged from their workspaces, curious of the findings and the gathering amassed. Out from the receding smoke appeared German's silhouette. He exchanged a few inaudible words with Luna, already positioned in waiting, before turning to them. His eyes fixed on Lawrence, and donning an apologetic expression. The recent times had at first seen a short burst of inspiration. It would have its end, marked by the few samples at their disposal. Running experiments literally made the blood run dry, and in order to continue, more was needed. That in turn conjured the problem of labyrinth delving. The more economically minded of German's students had realized that payment would be next to non-existent for some time ahead, and had reasonably left. Remaining were the Hamlet veterans and a few other faithful in the organization. But it would prove still too few for the type of rapid progress needed. In addition to more blood samples, more chalices needed to be found in order to increase their chances to find the former. Sorry. Nothing this time. German unhinged the handle of the burial blade from his back. The others, slowly and crestfallen, retreated back to their barracks. No, I understand. The anticipated onlookers, one by one, resumed their idling. We need more prospectors. The problem is plain to see.
And with what money shall they be paid with?
Arms crossed, Luna turned to Lawrence. Yeah, I know. Funding is not what it once was. I suppose me and the lads could do some work around town. Lawrence shook his head slowly and unconvincingly at German's suggestion. The idea did not sound preferable, but would perhaps see to money coming. By now, only the four of them were left before the chalice altar. There was always a constant stream of sounds within the hall, as people were talking and racking around with tools and equipment. The walling panels dampened the echo, but never quite produced any silence. Lawrence sighed. I don't know. I don't have an answer. You should, German countered. Many look to you now. Not that they have chosen you, but if it escaped you, it just turned out as such. For one, Carol certainly held him in such regards. Seeing Lauren's uncertainty in the moment made an uncomfortable stirring in her gut. It targeted her mind and threatened to rack it with a dreadfully familiar anxiety. A barrier to ward it off had been held in place by their work. Perhaps she was not the only one with such a barrier that now seemed all too fragile. All right, so we need money. We still need your work. What service could a bunch of researchers do?
How did Bergenworth do it?
They were rich. The richest being Willem. And they had donations pouring in from all over. Gods. They could even afford free basic lectures. We have nothing. It's just us and the work that few know about.
My family's rich. They could...
No, Luna, please. His eyes started, unfocused on sights, fueled by scattered thoughts. What are you thinking, Lawrence? German was quick to draw his aimless attention. Perhaps it was stupid, but I knew little else. Seemed doable back then. So, what seems doable now? I don't know. A steady pace and a miracle. While she did recognize that hard work is seldom rewarded immediately, The feeling of disparity for the future made her all the same conjure doubt. Did you ever think, after the Hamlet, did you ever consider just to quit, Gammon? The side of his mouth twitched. They looked at one another intently. No, it never passed me by, and I will never consider it either. Not after what I've seen. Not after knowing what might be out there, beyond our sight.
Luna?
From looking up into the ceiling, feet up on the table and slightly tilting on her chair with a book in her lap, biting at the end of a pen, she looked at Carol.
Yeah? Are you occupied?
She shrugged.
Not properly. Well, I had this thing that I cannot for the life of me figure out. A thing?
Carol grimaced at how poorly she had initially phrased her dilemma.
No, it's not one thing. It's more like a sound that I've heard. It could be rats. Sorry to say it, but I think this building may not have been properly seen to over the years. It's not rats. Oh, it's like an idea, or a word in a sentence that makes no sense because I have not heard the whole thing. Huh.
She balanced on the two back legs of the chair.
Tricky one. I know what you mean. Can't you draw it? You usually find your ideas when you are drawing. Not this time. It's like I'm missing something. Oh, sounds tricky. Sorry, but I don't know how to help out here. No? I thought if I could talk about it. Sounds like you should do something. That usually jogs the brain into figuring things out.
She nodded and lumbered out back into the makeshift corridor, where she sat herself down at the front area of the church, by the entry gate where some chairs stood, as if having been misplaced. She took out her small notebook, but found that she had displaced her pen and was rendered sitting motionless instead. The doors opened and German walked inside, not dressed in his typical attire and looked very casual. Carol? He nodded to her as he came up.
Where's Maria?
He stopped. Oh, she's up on the roof. She has the most peculiar places.
Oh my. On the roof, you say? Well, I suppose it is appropriate. But is she doing all right?
He looked down to the side and nodded absent-mindedly. Better. She's doing better. Which is good. Missing a pen there? He pointed to her lap, where the book still lay open.
Oh, yes, but I wouldn't know what to write anyway.
No, you usually do.
Well, it's more specific this time.
She looked up at him to meet his eyes. Their clear and vibrant hue looked back warmly at her.
It It's larger, perhaps. A whole thing that is out there and all around, like the air we breathe.
And you want to describe it,
Yes.
but find no words for it.
Yes.
He glanced up towards the ceiling and kept his gaze there.
It's not all, German. It's not just one thing. It's like I'm sensing a ghost. A someone. Someone that wants something.
And you sense this someone.
No, I hear. Or something in between.
I see. Quite intriguing.
It's quite frustrating, I must admit. Everything else only demanded focus, and I could bring it into the world. A rune could make it permanent, like how you instantly hear the pronunciation of a letter just by looking at it.
It's all about the sounds, as I understand it then.
Yes.
And here is a sound that you cannot understand like the others. You know how in an orchestra there are numerous instruments and together you can barely distinguish a single one. You only hear a complete symphony. You follow?
Uh-huh.
An instrument conveys plenty of impressions in and of itself. Much more than a letter, like you said. So what you might be hearing now is not one instrument, but several. One composition you hear, but cannot fathom.
Carol? Hello?
She darted up from the sitting area with a face so red it felt hot and hurried towards the sound. In the process of closing the sizable church door was Imogen, with her back turned to Carol as she came up behind her like a hunting cat. She turned and her eyes widened as well as her smile that later erupted in a surprised laughter that echoed in the hall.
Oh my! You frightened me! What's with you? You are all red. Hello, Imogen. It's just very echoing in here, and people are trying to work. I can see that. My word. How exciting to finally be independent. Oh, I'm so proud of you, Carol.
She led her into the corridor, where one or two curious heads peeked out from their enclosed workspaces. She led her into her own personal cubicle with one desk, a chair and a bookcase, leaving little room for much else.
Please sit down. Oh, but then you have no seat. I can stand.
Imogen then drew up her long dress and sat herself down with her legs crossed directly on the floor. Carol then felt it would become incredibly awkward for her to sit in the chair so high above her friend, so she did the same.
Cozy. I need your help with something. With what?
From the desk she clumsily grabbed the paper note with the moon rune and showed it to her.
Ah, one of your runes. Is it new? No, but I feel like one is about to show itself. That's why I need help. Oh, ever so thrilling. I get to help make a rune. Yes, but you need to focus, so you can, understand. Alright. What do you need me to do? First, I would need you to hear what I hear. How would I do that? Let's just start with this one.
She handed over the paper.
Focus on this and try to make all your senses perceive it, not just sight.
Imogen sharpened her expression and looked intently at the symbol.
It might sound foolish, but try and ask it how it would sound.
Imogen giggled and Carol blushed.
Do not give it a sound. Focus on it until you hear it. Do the same with how it would smell, feel and sense, all within your mind.
In a moment's time, Imogen's expression softened and her eyes began almost to glisten. The corner of her mouth twitched occasionally, like they tried to withhold a smile.
I would like you to try and use this as a reference. It felt so warm and kind. I know. If you could, try and use it as you listen to the air.
Huh?
Well, not the air, but the surroundings. The world, if you will. Oh. I'll do it with you. Perhaps we can hear the symphony together. We are listening after a symphony? No, remember the rune. Close your eyes and listen.
After Imogen had done so, Carol closed her eyes. In the great hall they heard someone nearby scribbling in a notebook. Someone stood up and walked over the stone floor with echoing footsteps. Someone cleared their throat and a low conversation began, of which the words one could not fully hear. Carol opened her eyes and found that her friend had furrowed her brow. She took hold of her hands.
Do not focus on all the sounds individually. Try and place them in an orchestra and listen to what symphony emerges.
In her own mind, Carol did so, and very quickly did a sound that she had heard many times before come to her. It was the sound that emerged when all things found a rhythm. Every little sound around her, even the ones she herself produced. In between emerged a constant humming, almost sounding as if made by a singular basal voice. Imogen gasped.
What was that? Did you hear it too? Yes, and I don't know what it could be.
They had opened their eyes, and Imogen looked at her hands held by Carol as if surprised. She let go.
Oh, is it always like that? You hear such a sound with all the runes?
She twirled with her fingers and did not look at her, posing the question.
No, it's always different, and usually clearer. Like I know exactly what its form would look like. But with this... Well, I wouldn't know, but it did remind me of an old folk tradition. It's a way of singing in perpetuity. Something about constantly breathing while making the sound, or something. But I know it was ritualistic. I studied it extensively some time ago. It was in veneration to the all-god Elden. Like the church's Elden. Indeed. In ages past, before the institution of the nobility, the pagan belief placed Elden as king of gods, and mankind built these domes, holy ritual rooms that were designed to capture sounds. It was believed that by singing, one could invoke the god King Elden, as he only existed in voice. And that song was very much like that sound. Elden. Could it be?
With the sound still present within her, more so like an echoing reverberation than a recollection, she grasped the pen and straight onto the floor she drew 3 lines, with the middle one ending up slightly shorter than the rest. If it had been her own faculties behind the decision, or something else, she could not be the judge of. Just as she received the sensation of displeasure from not having accurately captured the sound properly, Imogen swiped the pen from her, and in the same motion drew a convex arc that had its lowest point merging with the tip of the center line and crossing over the adjacent 2. She finished by making a dot over each of the lines.
There. Elden.
Weighing on his mind, frequently as of late, was the concealed thoughts of Maria. He had asked German of her guarded opinions, but he had little to say. There was only further confirmation that she was troubled. As to the solution, there was none. To Lawrence, the what was obvious, but a thought that had grown for some time was, did it become better for her being here? He fiddled with a pencil in his hand, staring at his desk. The thoughts dominated his being and dampened every other sense. Was it ever a good idea? Was it ever what anyone needed? Had he been selfish? He knew very well, since first arriving back at Bergenworth from the fishing hamlet, that he needed to get away in a sense. But could he quit his work? The answer had early on been a plain no. For better or worse, he needed more answers and would not rest to get them, for as long as he had such thoughts. One day he would likely feel satisfied and proceed to different fields, but not yet. And now, had he dragged his friends along, convinced them of something only he wanted? Even Luna's mind seemed to grow foggy and hold mysterious opinions the more he pondered. He threw the pen desperately, stood and walked out of his makeshift workplace. He swiftly made way for the gate and stepped outside, into the freshness of the air. There he remained, attempting to think of nothing. In the growing void of his mind, a little notion rippled through the senses. A distracting sound, a rustling. It was but a sudden and low sound, but followed by another of similar nature, the sound of movement. He looked to the bushes along the front wall. They indeed moved, slightly and periodically. He inched himself closer and found a little furry thing cowering underneath the greenery. A common cat, one of the many street dwellers. It grew still and looked back at him. The eyes were somewhat dull and unfocused for a cat's. Being friendly, he reached out to pet it. It growled, but did nothing to avoid what it apparently disagreed with. His hand patted down on its head, and the ears folded down and remained so. Its head lowered further to the ground. As it did, he saw crimson over its back. Even to the degree exposed flesh was seen as a red patch in the brown-white fur. "Oh my, what happened to you, little one?" He whispered to himself and reached to grab it. It growled once more, but did not scramble to get away. "Come on, can't leave you here like this now." It did surprisingly little in the form of resistance, and was limply dragged out from underneath the vegetation. It appeared tired, narrowing its eyes and continuously protesting with a low and guttural sound. The wound was indeed extensive, and reached down in small slices on its side. He was no expert in feline medicine, but deduced it was simply too weak to resist him. He walked back inside and towards one of their laboratories. It was empty, and he placed the cat on a table. It stayed put, sitting hunched. He leaned over to peer at the open wound. A sizable patch of furless exposure. He first thought to sanitize it, but grew hesitant because of the pain it would suffer. The more he considered treatment, the more severe the damage seemed. It occurred to him in a flash. The rats. The blood. He was made to stand still, examining the creature as he decided the ethics and the procedure. The deciding factor was his curiosity, triumphing over the willingness to enter an arduous procedure akin to that of treating a human. He left the cat in nervous hopes it would remain where it was. He darted into the next compartment to swiftly grab a syringe, bandage, and a vial of blood used in the rat experiment. Adding to the stressful factor was his abrupt realization he might not be as informed about a cat's anatomy as he might think. Even though the administration of blood was simple enough, even with rats, he anxiously thought there could very well be complications. Offloading what he had brought and assuring himself the little feline was fine for the moment, he rushed off once more. He hurriedly entered the far back compartment, where most of their books were temporarily stored in different piles. However, he quickly gave up on the effort due to the massively disorganized literature and comforted himself that a vein would be simple enough to find, despite the deviations. The blood would simply have to be done as an emergency. He rushed back with a sense of foolishness and as quickly as he could filled the syringe. The cat had lowered itself to the table's surface and had its neck stretched out, mouth open slightly. Syringe in hand, he procured a magnifying glass and peered closer at the tissue of the wound. It was a mess, and little was to be seen of what he was hoping to. Not being fully certain of any present veins and lack of experience, he did an attempt as best as could. The needle pierced into the pulpish tissue. The cat made a squeak, an aggravated sound, but did not move. He retracted the needle and just stood, looking and waiting expectantly. He stood foolishly for some minutes before realizing it could not possibly be so sudden on such a larger circulatory system. Or had he been unfortunately wrong? He filled up the syringe once more and attempted anew in a slight variation to the same spot. With some renewed energy, the cat crawled backwards slightly and growled at him. He grabbed hold around the back of its neck and forced it gently to lie on the table, then swiftly made the needle enter. After which he turned around for but a moment to start weaving the roll of bandage. But when he turned, he was petrified with astonishment. The cat sat up with a typical feline posture and was licking at the wound. In but a brief moment had the wound already appeared to have healed, as if a whole day had passed. It was as if the tongue of the cat possessed supernatural healing abilities. It looked up at him afterwards, blinking its eyes. The excitement overwhelmed him to the degree he dropped the roll of bandage and rushed out from the laboratory. He looked around and saw down the walkway the back of Carol's head, sitting on one of the couches.
"Hey, you will never believe it!"
He shouted towards her, and he briskly walked her way. She turned around clumsily to give an uncertain look at him.
Me? The holy blood is indeed holy. It just saved a life, you see. Oh, that's... how do you mean? Just like it sounds. And as with the rats, it can cure wounds.
She looked both skeptically and apologetic for not apparently being able to find him serious. Her eyes were soon attracted by another character. The cat walked casually by his feet and towards the side of the couch, and in the place of the morbid wound was but a large scar visible for her to see.
Maria, heavens, it's been a bit.
Shepard must have acquired supernatural instincts due to how quickly he had taken notice of her. having barely stepped over the threshold into the tavern. Upon closing the distance between them, the broad teeth-revealing grin receded. So too seemed the urge to embrace her. Although the healthy bustling of people and crowded murmur was very much present, it only appeared to her as unfocused noise. The veil of the fishing hamlet would still hang over her eyes, making her appearance much less vibrant and friendly as it once was. But when in the presence of characters like him, the veil lifted just a bit.
How are...
He bit down on his lower lip, rendering his mouth invisible by the cover of his large moustache. But he sharpened himself and greeted her with warmer, calmer eyes.
I'm glad to see you again. I was getting a tad worried. Judging by your looks, you're not here for drinks, I take it. Provisions, is it?
He motioned her to follow him back behind the bar desk.
I am. The others have endured the trip so many times that I thought it proper to share it.
He nearly had to duck beneath the doorframe leading into the kitchen, a stark contrast to the crowded tavern floor.
I'm glad to see you too, by the way. And business is good?
Piles of crates were stacked in a corner, filled with vegetables, potatoes and other groceries that he began hauling outside a back door.
Well, for me, great as it have ever been. As for the recruitment, not so great. I keep telling German that there must be more pay. Then there will be loads of signers. I keep telling them more and more stories and they keep coming back. But always has that excitement fade when hearing about a bloody pay.
Following the man outside, there was already a cart in waiting, onto which he started piling the crates. His rant continued and transitioned into a muttering upon opening up a cellar door and faded even further as he disappeared inside. Leaning in the doorframe, she awaited his return, hearing the same string of conversation become progressively lower, then louder, until the bald head peeked out at her.
You know,
Yes, we are well aware.
She answered, as if she had heard everything he had said.
But there are little money in our business, as per my reason being here. There are barely funds for food on the table. I sometimes doubt Lauren's reasons for pulling us away like he did.
She crossed her arms. The conversation had begun to draw back the allegorical veil over her eyes.
his reason is your well-being.
He stepped out entirely, carrying more crates.
I do not know Lawrence well, but from the little I do know, I consider him a good lad, doing whatever he can for his friends.
6 crates had been produced onto the cart. Now he turned to her and slapped his hands together.
I also know of the effect recent events had on you all, and I deeply respect what he did for your sake. I hear from German it was money out of his own pocket that bought you a new place, as well as a decent apartment in the city. That sort of deeds reminds me of a certain pair of mentors I used to have.
She managed to blush at the indication, and from embarrassment at having doubted the one who had done so much. Due to the topic of their conversation, she was properly startled when Lauren's face peeked around the doorway, so much so that she jumped back in surprise at the sheer coincidence. "Oh, Maria! No one told me you had left. And all by yourself?" Shepard chuckled at her expense.
Well, we were just talking, then you appeared.
He smiled and raised his hands towards her, mimicking a scary monster. "Good thing I came. These tend to be slightly too much for one person. Is this the supplies, Shepard?" He pointed and moved to grasp the handles of the cart. The trip had been made on her part with little afterthought. In hindsight, she had only known a task needed to be done, and that it could serve her with some fresh air. Little energy had been spared for the calculation of the task itself.
Sure is. Threw in some ribs for you as well.
You are too kind. As long as it doesn't turn into a loss for you.
It's never a loss in regards to good friends. But I do have a tavern to run, so I'll leave you to it.
He stopped in the doorway, looking at her as he passed.
It was good seeing you, Maria.
Then he stepped inside and through the door behind the counter.
You needn't have come, Lawrence. I would have managed fine.
He turned the cart around, holding the handles so it was rolling behind him. I know you would have. But then again, I did not know you had left to begin with. They departed the alley, emerging on a sloping street, running down to the lowest and oldest part of town. To be frank, I was very surprised to see you out of everyone here. I don't mean to imply anything rude. She did not take it as such. She knew what he implied. Her head turned towards the cobblestones as they walked, smiling and giving no verbal response. I won't try and say anything about it, but I do hope you will come and talk to me if you ever feel the need. I was so afraid when Luna refused, but she came around, after many pestering attempts. Then with Carol, I started becoming afraid once more. But with her, it was not my many trying attempts that got her to open up, but us moving here. The downward-leaning street flattened, in addition to transitioning into a more poorer laid cobblestone. The streets were smaller, and so were the houses, placed more at random than the standard architecturally coherent layout, from new to old. I mean to say that we all have our issues. Issues that I don't know how to solve. So if there is anything you feel like you need to do, tell me. Despite it all, I can at least try to help you. The veil slowly lifted once more, and the world appeared as it used to be. She knew of what he spoke of. Ridding herself of the veil was a mystery. The strength to even try with it present was faint, but she began to slowly see the pattern in which she was periodically relieved of it. There was nothing she could tell Lawrence, or any other, only that it had to be fine as it was, at least for now. Entering the streets that housed their church was like walking into another town. It was clear they did not live in the wealthy district, but in its opposite. Here, the foundations dated back to the very first generations of settlers. Along the river stood old brick houses that likely had been replaced or reinforced once or twice before the people decided to simply expand their modification outward, making Yarnum grow into the massive size it currently was. A door suddenly flung open and a woman came rushing out, directly aimed at them. Maria initially turned to face the incoming person in a defensive stance, but seeing the teary distress on her face, she relaxed somewhat.
Oh, help him! You must help him, please!
She sobbed and screamed at them, hands shaking and held by her chest.
What? We'll help you. What is wrong?
Maria nearly shouted to overcome the woman's volume.
I need a doctor now. Come, it's my son. He's sick. Come, please.
Feeling competent from her studies, she acted more on adrenaline and moved towards the quaint abode. The woman stumblingly rushed before her, leading her inside.
Wait, Maria!
Lawrence shouted behind her back. She heard the sound of the cart's handles touching the stone and his following steps. The interior was small and narrow. Straight on through from the entry and inside another door was a small bedroom. The little decor and clutter gave the impression of a child's chambers. In a bed lay a boy, perhaps 10 of age, breathing fast and faintly and looking like death had already claimed him, pale but damp with sweat.
The doctor was supposed to come yesterday, but... And now...
The woman burst out weeping. Lawrence tumbled in after them. Maria stepped up closer to the child.
Oh, is it an emergency? Shall I go after the doctor?
The woman was unresponsive, and Maria knelt down by the boy's side. He did not acknowledge her presence, if he at all was aware of it. She lifted the covers to find the chest wrapped in bandages. There was a dark patch on the right lower shoulder.
Could be blood poisoning.
Is it urgent, Maria?
I don't know.
Laying her head over his heart, she found it beating much too slow.
I don't think there is time to get the doctor.
What's with him? What's his symptoms? Lawrence turned to the weeping woman.
I don't know. He just He hasn't done anything since coming home. I, I don't even know where he got that.
Maria stood, turning back at them, shaking her head.
It was a while ago.
The woman nodded, hands over her mouth, eyes red and torn by tears. Maria, do you remember the cat? Lauren's eyes fixed on the boy behind her. She bit her lip. I think right now it's worth it, don't you? There was fear for what could happen no matter what they did. Was the unfair end in a sickbed a worse fate? Lawrence had not grown petrified by thoughts in his head like her, and stepped forward impressively fast and efficiently scooped up the boy. Get back to the church and prepare.
What are you doing? Can you save him?
The woman became suddenly clearer from the sobbing, hope shining in her gaze. Weighing the outcomes, it was that sliver of hope in the woman that made Maria sprint out, back into the street and down to the church. First she saw German, sitting alone on a bench next to the gate. It was closed, and he looked half asleep. When she stepped onto the dirt path leading through the yard, he flew up and ran to meet her. What's wrong?
We have...
The words stuck in her throat. It sounded so unbelievable in her head.
Prepare the blood. The same Lawrence treated the cat with.
German turned, not looking surprised or questioning, and ran back with her following. Why is that blood? It's just like the rest. He pushed the gate open, and they both sprinted into the cubicles.
A bed or a table, something to lie on, and a drip stand. Do we have one?
What are we doing?
Get them set up.
She threw herself inside a random section and began offloading the table of books and papers.
What's going on?
Luna casually sauntered inside, looking as if preparing to joke about the situation.
We are administering blood, Luna. Get things in order. Lawrence is coming with a sick boy any moment.
Reacting similarly to German on first hearing the deal, she simply turned around in her tracks and was gone. German shortly arrived with a vial of old blood. We don't have a drip stand.
How did Lawrence do it then?
He did not use one.
Well, we must now. You know the theory?
Seamus came running and stood in the opening.
Lawrence is coming with some kid. What's happening?
We are treating him. Go help Luna find what she needs.
First, he looked at her surprised. Then he turned his head down to the church gate, then towards where Luna had disappeared and vanished after her. Having not been able to fully clear the table when Lawrence came shuffling in, boy in arms, she simply swept the remaining clutter off. Winded from the hasted walk, he nearly dropped the lad onto the table. Maria aided by resting the fragile head in her hand, guiding it gently down on the wood. Lawrence, what are we? It's under control, Gaman. He cast a glance back at the nerve-wracked mother coming after him. Ready the blood?
Yes.
Luna stepped in, carrying a large vial and a narrow tube. After her came Seamus, with a large leather satchel.
The needles. Get the blood into this vial, then fasten the tube.
She placed the glass container next to the blood, and German swiftly did as instructed.
Blood?
The woman timidly asked.
Sir? Blood?
Yes.
But... how?
It's holy blood. Now give us some room. It will need to be administered slowly. She appeared starstruck. If it was God-fearing piousness or sheer fright for her child remained unknown, but she did not press it further and distanced herself to the sidelines.
We don't have an extractor.
What?
We need to mix the bloods. Don't you remember?
Lawrence stood still for a moment, looking into thin air, then jolted his head. Right. We'll have to blend them beforehand. Luna rolled her eyes nervously.
Alright. Prepare the syringe, Seamus.
Maria looked down at the boy's face. A pale little doll, nearly inhuman from the sickness. The mother too had her eyes fixed exclusively on her son. It all seemed so mad in the middle of everyone running about in preparation. She consoled herself with that it had been even more madness to have simply left him where he had laid, while part of her argued and cursed her for not having simply searched up a doctor. The truth echoed loudly in her head that no proper doctor could have been found in the vicinity within their short window of time. Seamus entered her view with the syringe and filled it with blood from the boy's arm. German came with the vial, and they quickly emptied the contents of the syringe inside. He stirred it gently, then in with the tube through the cork. The flask went upside down, and another needle went back into the arm. Everything was still and silent, save for the heavy breaths of Lawrence, who only now saw reprieve. German was forced to stand with the vial held up as it began to slowly administer the blood into the small child. Luckily for him, it was but a child, who did not need such a quantity for the vial to be unreasonably heavy. Luna leaned over to Lawrence and whispered, out of the mother's earshot.
Perhaps it was too large a dose.
Perhaps it was too little, Lawrence retorted.
By the gods, it is blood.
The woman's eyes were wide, staring at the vial. Now, fear not. I assure you it may appear startling, but it is a healing concoction of the highest quality.
But it is blood. And in the church of the Healing Mother. Her blood.
Lawrence nervously searched his head for words. Well, we have studied it, you see. It is in fact holy blood, retrieved from the labyrinth. Just try and relax, and we should see some results soon. Lawrence walked over to her. His approach did not soothe her fears.
But then, what are you doing in the church?
Well, see now. Miraculously, what saved him from likely deceitful explanation was the faint groan of the boy. Every head snapped towards him, and the mother gasped loudly. The small eyes blinked open and curiously peered around. The mother stumbled slowly forward, looking more as if she beheld fire for the first time in human history. The boy's eyes latched onto her face, still looking pale and weak.
Mom? By gods!
Tears would not yet cease their descent over her face, but she was rendered astonishedly motionless, standing over her boy.
A miracle! How do you feel?
Maria leaned over him to catch his eye. He looked at her expressionlessly.
Sleepy? Are you hurt? Feel any sickness?
He paused, more so out of fatigue than afterthought.
No, just sleepy.
Luna looked at the vial. A little less than half had been injected into his small body, which proportionally had not been a very remarkable quantity.
Should we continue?
Maria asked and looked around the room. Lawrence came up and stood over the boy. Do you feel anything strange? Anything at all?
No. No. Where are the little ones?
His eyes fluttered as if falling asleep. Now, don't sleep just yet. What do you mean? What little ones? He looked down onto his stomach, then over in search of the room.
The little people. They were here just now.
All right. Can you sit up? His eyes began opening a bit more, and one could almost see the process of life returning in its color to the little face.
Yeah, I think so.
The head tilted upwards.
Careful with the arm.
Maria took hold gently over the needle and guided him along in the motion so he could support his ascent with the elbow. The mother stepped beside him, one hand on his back, one on his left shoulder.
A miracle.
Her mouth hung open.
By the gods. Sweetie, look at me.
Eyes focused on the mother, although tired, was filled with life.
You were sick now, remember?
He nodded slowly.
But not anymore? Nothing certain? Here.
He pointed to where Maria still held her arm on the needle.
That's okay. Not anywhere else? How about here, sweetie?
She lightly touched with the tip of her fingers on the bandaged dark patch on his lower right shoulder. He looked and seemed a bit surprised at what he saw.
No.
Maria turned to the rest, frowning thoughtfully. They too conveyed puzzling expressions. Right. Let's see about it. Lawrence moved to unwrap the bandage. "Perhaps you should look away, son." He appeared remarkably healthy and perplexed to what they were hoping to find. Slowly weaving the somewhat sloppily applied cloth revealed some dried pus. Then, upon discovering the wound, they only found loose scab matter over blank and healthy skin. Nothing, the mother gasped.
It's healed.
It is, Lawrence said, nearly as astonished as her.
It is the healing blood. Oh, thank you. Oh, good clerics. Thank the holy blood.
Awoken much too late in the morning, Maria drowsily made the long trip down the slopes to Old Yarnum. Sleep would be scarce in the night, but keep with her long into the day. Since the incident with the treated child, the nights had been worse. At first, she had not known what it was, that lump deep in her chest, that thing which made her nauseous at times. The thing had simply been a thought in her head all that time. But despite the fact that all their evidence gathered from several experiments pointed to the same conclusion, that the old blood bestowed remarkable properties to any organic matter it came in contact with, the thought still concerned an equally true notion, that something that did not belong had been imparted to the child's body, and foreign things in biology seldom merge so readily. Was it simply that easy? The blood of the gods? She walked the same path every day, down the steep street towards Old Yarnum from the city centre. As she turned a corner by which they had been dragged into spontaneously treating the child a few days past, making the church come into view, she heard a noise. The cry of a newborn, rather distinct but distant. She stopped and turned around. Had it come from inside one of the houses? It was but a short burst, then nothing more. More so having been startled by the noise, rather than induced by concern or curiosity, she continued on her way as if it never happened. Not only was the church gate half ajar on approach, with movement inside, a stranger was kneeling in front of the statue of the healing mother. Though faith in Yarnum still held the figure of the fair maiden within their pantheon, none had thus far come to pray before the statue outside the old church. Inside sat 4 individuals on a bench just by the entry. 2 middle-aged men, 1 younger man, and a much younger girl. They did not appear particularly related, but shared the appearance of the downtrodden, an appearance common to old Yarnum. The four looked at her, and she stopped to look at them. Had it been only one stranger inside their workplace, she would have taken the effort to ask about their presence. But their numbers made her will shrink, and she just nodded at them, walking past and further inside. She peeked inside the first cubicle to the left, then to the right, looking for someone to ask about the four strangers. Out from an opening further down emerged a much older man, followed by Lawrence. Now come right back if you notice anything strange. And I mean anything, you hear? You can count on experiencing fatigue in some hours, but it ought not to be anything more. He patted the senior on his shoulder. The man smiled and nodded like a happy little child.
I will.
Then I'll see you tomorrow, if not sooner. But it likely won't come to that. Passing her, the man muttered in awe to himself.
Praise the gods. Praise the old blood. Oh, by the gods.
She stopped and saw him leave for the gate. Maria, good you are here. Sleep any better? He maintained the smile, but asked in a tone that was much more serious.
Fine, thanks. What is happening? Who was that?
Right. Come help me prepare. They made their way back into the space from which he had first appeared. The floor had been cleared for a single chair in the middle. A drip stand stood by it, with an empty jar attached. Residue of blood still within. I must have you read my recordings of people's accounts. Most curious. Some stunningly echoes the boy's testimony of seeing little ones. Just like the tales of blood healing, no?
Did you just...
He removed the bottle. Well, it was rather strange for us too this morning. The three of us arrived to find George conversing with a man by the gate, asking for the clerics. He chuckled a bit, disassembling the tube and the needle, placing them on a tray. He was there to seek aid for his brother, you see, but he was not able to walk. A fall into the river produced a broken leg. We sent some of the lads to get him, along with the man, but in the time they took, another pair showed up with an ailment of their own, also asking for the clerics. There was not much effort on her part with the cleaning. She stared in astonishment as he turned around with a tray of used equipment.
But... did you really?
What? They looked at each other, him with patient surprise, her with disbelief.
Lawrence, this is not any blood. What of the consequences?
He narrowed his lips and nodded, walking past her in disregard to her accusation. There's nothing so far that indicates side effects. Granted, old Whiskers is a cat, but nonetheless, nothing ill have befallen him, nor the young boy. Besides, We do know that the Maiden Saint treated the old plague with blood.
A most credible source. Legends.
Come now, the event was real, and blood used for such purpose was more or less confirmed in the labyrinth.
Right. But there have been no tests. And now it is them that will confirm? Are you not slightly worried?
He turned around a panel at the church's far end, where new and clean equipment waited. Among tubs of water and disinfectant, he placed the unclean tools of the craft. I am. Of course I am. But did you not see the face of the mother? The face of a child as they embraced? I thought then it was worth it, but boy was I scared. I am currently scared for that man that you just passed. He could return tomorrow, suffering from God knows what. During his reply, he had assembled a new set of equipment that stood ready for him. Or he might come back as healthy as ever, like that child did. First and foremost, we must adhere to the scientific evidence, and although they are hypotheses, everything points to no side effects. Never has the old blood behaved in such a way during experiments. So far, I have only seen what the healing of the blood does. And it is beautiful. But you are right. For some time, I will continue to be afraid for them. They walked down the same centered path, back to the same area. You can get the next one soon. He put down his container and looked at her. So, remember? Evolution without courage, Maria? With contempt that she hid very poorly, she chuckled at his reasoning.
Fear the old blood, Lawrence.
His smile vanished, and she followed him inside.